So my clock here says 5:30, so I think we're gonna go ahead and start. Good evening. My name is Annette Mills, and on behalf of the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition's Energy Action Team, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. The focus of the Energy Action Team is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're speeding the transition to renewable energy through Solarize Corvallis, increasing residential and commercial energy efficiency through our retrofit clinics and Saving Green programs, and laying the foundation for a home energy score program in Corvallis. Although we firmly believe that what we do locally matters, we also know that the transition away from fossil fuels to renewables needs to happen on a much larger scale, and that's the focus of tonight's program. The latest report from the world's climate scientists, as well as our own experience during this past summer's heat waves, have made it very clear that we no longer have the luxury of making a gradual transition away from coal, oil, and natural gas. Our situation calls for urgent action now. We know that there's no more time for business as usual. And that's why we jumped at the chance when Christy Anderson Brecken offered to make a presentation about addressing climate change at the state level. Christy is president of the board of the Oregon Citizens Utility Board, which represents the interests of Oregon's residential utility customers before administrative, judicial, and legislative bodies. Christy is also an instructor in the Department of Applied Economics at Oregon State University. She teaches agricultural law, environmental law, introduction to environmental law, policy and economics, and food systems. Christy received her law degree from the University of Minnesota in 2005 and master's degree in agricultural and resource economics at OSU in 2011. Welcome, Christy.
Thank you, Annette, and thanks everybody for joining tonight. I will share my screen so you can see my slides. All right, I think that's all good. So Annette did tell you all of these things, so that's fantastic. I don't have to tell you more about that, I don't think. Let me just move on. So we are on Zoom, as we all know. I'm back teaching in the classroom, which is fabulous, but I have a lot of experience teaching on Zoom now and giving presentations. So we'll just do a couple of ground rules. So we will stay muted unless speaking, and we will, but I'm very happy to answer your questions or, take comments during the presentation. You don't have to wait till it's over because it's scheduled to be an hour and a half. So I think it's useful to have questions as we go, and I'm used to that from teaching. So if you want to do that, I will monitor the chat while I'm presenting. So if you want to type something into the chat, I'll keep my eye on it and will respond when I have a good time to do that. And if you want to ask a question verbally, you can use the raise hand function, and I will recognize you and you can unmute and ask your question that way too, and we can have that conversation. So I'm happy to do it however you're comfortable with it. And I think it's useful to have a dialogue and a conversation so that you get what you want out of it. It's not just me saying what I think you need to hear, right? So here's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to talk about the future of natural gas in Oregon. And our plan is to go from the more general information to the more specific. So Annette asked me to really start at the beginning so that we have a good foundation and who has authority to regulate natural gas, what type of authority do they have, so that we can really go to the source in order to understand, where the levers are in order to make change, right? So we'll go from the context to that authority to some recent decarbonization laws in Oregon that have an impact on the future of natural gas. And then finally, I'll talk more specifically about the current Public Utility Commission fact-finding investigation that's happening right now. So, and give some things that I think, or and Cub thinks, and recommendations about where we may go and how you might think about this and participate. So our shared assumption here is that this group's goal is the decarbonization of our economy, right? And there is, the scientific and economic consensus is that there are three pillars of decarbonization. I do have citations in these slides if you want to look up something more deeply, but there are several sources for these ideas. And basically, we have the technical capacity to do this, and it is economically feasible now. And those three pillars are energy efficiency first, then decarbonizing electricity, and then finally switching direct use fuels such as natural gas or petroleum to electric sources. And we're at the point where these things need to be happening simultaneously, right? We can't wait. We can't do them just in this, do all of energy efficiency and then move on, right? We're doing them simultaneously. And I think what should be the fourth pillar, we should change this to 4, is considering equity for underadvantaged communities and advancing environmental justice in the process, because I think this is the perfect time, and we have so much opportunity to be doing all of these things at once, and we have to always keep equity in mind when we're doing this work. So when we think about natural gas, I don't know why we'll try this instead. There we go. When we think about natural gas, so electricity here as 25% of the US greenhouse gases by sector. This was 32% in, I think, 2012. And so you can see that electricity, that percent of electricity has come down. So we are decarbonizing electricity and have been for some time. And then when we add in natural gas and trying to get rid of natural gas, right, it's going to mean that this commercial and residential space is going to have to be moved into the electricity space, right? And so that's why decarbonizing electricity is important. And industry as well, some of that may be, electrified. Agriculture, some of that may be electrified that isn't now. Transportation, that's what we talked about last week. That's prime for electrification as well. So once we start piling this all into electricity, you can see why decarbonizing electricity is so critical. So there will be a couple of times tonight when we will talk about decarbonizing electricity, but it's not the main topic. All right, so if our goal is decarbonization, how do we get there, right? We don't have any time to lose at this point. If that's the mountaintop we're getting to and we're down here with the trees in front of us, it's much faster and easier to follow an existing path. So find the path, we're going to take it. So talking about who has authority to regulate, what they have authority over, and what those paths are, I think is really an important part of the toolbox that we bring to this work. All right, and this is a big topic of all the classes that I teach. Successful policy requires us to align our legal institutions, our economic institutions, what we know about science and our current technology, which is always changing and improving, and our values, right? So the science is not the focus for today. I'm not a scientist, but we will rely on expert analysis. So I will tell you some things, very basic, surface level things just about the science and technology that we have, but that's a deeper topic. And I know a lot of people are interested in that, but not my focus. My focus is how we make collective decisions. So economics is the study of how individuals make decisions, but once we move it to the legal setting, right, this is how we make collective decisions. So how that happens. And of course, economics is a big part of that institution and they're intertwined. So having a grounding in both of them. I was first interested in law because I thought, ooh, this is a powerful tool for making the world better, right? And then I quickly realized that a lot of the legal arguments I wanted to make were based in economic reasoning and economic studies and so forth. So much of our law revolves around economics that then I realized, okay, well, I'd better go get an econ degree. And so I have this part of the toolbox, and everyone needs some part of the toolbox, but we all need to be able to talk across those disciplines and find, where the overlap is. That's why I like this Venn diagram idea. And values are super important. So we're talking about, what do we hold dear? And what does it come down to, and when we make decisions personally and collectively, usually comes down to our values. So if we're going to make good decisions, we have to understand the science, the technology that's available. We have to understand the economic trade-offs. That's going to say something about, or it's going to speak to and help us make decisions based on our values. But really it comes down to our values at the end of the day, once we have the information, the good, solid information that we need from these other disciplines, right? So often when it comes down to values, it comes down to who is going to benefit from a certain decision and who is going to pay the costs of a certain decision. And so I think that's really important to remember, that we are making choices, right? But I want to give you a tiny bit of hope. I feel like as I study this stuff, every year there's a little more overlap between our science and technology and our values and our economics, right? We have technically feasible and economically feasible pathways to decarbonization. So those overlaps are happening, right? And if we can also push those legal institutions, that comes down and there's bigger overlap in our diagram. So that's what we're looking for. All right, so I told you that I'm focusing on the legal part of it here. So we're going to do a quick civics review. I know that we have some local political leaders here. They should know where they fit already, and we should all know where they fit in. And there's other levels of government who have different levels of authority over this topic. And it's going to take a portfolio of policies, right, at every level, because every level of government has different authority. So our system is a federalist system. So by federalism, we mean it's the authority, how governmental authority is divided between different levels of government. And it's fairly unique in the world that we have a federalist system. Not a lot of other countries have that. So if we start at the federal level, right, the federal powers are those limited to those in the Constitution. So I still have my pocket Constitution here because I always have it close. And Article 1, Section 8 tells us what the federal government can do, what the legislative branch can do, right? And so the really big one that allows the federal government to make laws that relate to pollution control and, similar things is the Commerce Clause. So the Clean Air Act, for our purposes, the Energy Security and Conservation Act, all kinds of things. And so the Commerce Clause just says that the federal government has the ability to regulate things that have a substantial impact on interstate commerce. So that can be a lot of things, right? So we understand based on court decisions that pollution created by commerce flows over state lines, impacts commerce in other states. And so we have some justification there. We also regulate products that cross state lines. So, so natural gas and electricity and all of this obviously has that connection. The federal government also gets to tax and spend, as we all know too well this week, right? And for natural gas, federal lands are important too, right? Because we do a lot of fracking on federal lands, and the federal government has the authority to determine what happens on federal land. So that is another place that may come into play. All right, at the state level, the states are really the original sovereigns of this country, right? We had the colonies. the 13 colonies broke free from Great Britain. They all had a governor. The governors were not going to give up their own power, right? They all said, no, we got our power from the king and we're going to hang on to this authority. They wanted, Virginians were Virginians and Rhode Islanders were Rhode Islanders, and they were not going to think of themselves as one thing. But they entered this constitution, it's almost like a contract between them, where the states gave up some power to the federal government, but the states, being the original sovereigns, have what we call the police powers, which is simply to regulate for the health, safety, and welfare of the people. So a lot of what states regulate comes from kind of this tradition of what they have always regulated. Before things like utilities really were interstate, right? So states would have originally regulated utilities, and we often respect that tradition in our system. So utility regulation, pollution, land use, water law, of course, they can tax and spend, and all of this interacts to some extent or a large extent with federal law, right? And so when we have federal laws that regulate some things like, coal or natural gas burning power plants that create electricity that reside in one state and that sell across state lines, right? Sell their electricity across state lines. The federal government doesn't just totally take that over. The states still have their power to regulate. And so we call this cooperative federalism. So a lot of our environmental laws have this cooperative federalist structure that allows the states to still have a tremendous amount of say and even make stricter laws than the federal laws are. So both are operating simultaneously, and their interaction is always interesting. Down to the local level, so local governments are technically just a subdivision of the state. So they also, the police powers flow to local government in their own jurisdiction, right, over local issues. So this can be utility agreements right away, like the local government gets to make its own decisions, but local laws can be preempted by state and federal laws. So there are some things in some states where the states will say, no, we're not going to let the local government deal with this, right? Only the state will say what the rule is here. So you do have the possibility of preemption at the local level too. But in Oregon, we tend to have a lot of local control, and even things that are regulated by the state, like the land use laws, have a role for the local governments, right? And finally, households are a decision-making unit, and but households are constrained. They have the power to make decisions given a choice set that is created by these other levels, right? So we are all constrained by the infrastructure of our world, how we get around, by the appliances that are even available for us to buy and put it in our house and how much they cost, right? And the vehicles and our budgets, our economy and how our economy is organized is, can create constraints on our households' abilities to make choices. So we have to remember that when we want households to take certain actions, they're sitting in this structure that constrains their choices, even if their values, if they could express their values in some ways, sometimes those choices aren't available to them. So putting all of this into perspective, I think, kind of helps us think about where there's some leverage, right, to make some changes that could affect different levels as well. I don't understand why that doesn't work. Okay, so a little bit more civics. The Constitution also establishes the lines of authority between the levels and branches of government. So I didn't give you the whole diagram of 3 branches of government and separation of powers and checks and balances, right? I think we know that. That's cool. So we do have our 3 branches of government. But then when we think about sort of lines of authority, then we remember that federal statutes and treaties are on the same level. And the Supremacy Clause says that federal statutes and treaties are supreme over the state laws. if there is a conflict. If there's not a conflict, they can both operate simultaneously and everything's fine, right? So that's where we get preemption. And let's just point out, there is no federal preemption of state utility regulation. There are federal rules that affect what happens to the utilities and how the utilities can operate. And sometimes that's a great leverage point for making some change. But it is not preempting what we will talk about as state utility regulation in other ways. So the other thing to think about here is the delegation doctrine. So the legislative branch passes the generally applicable laws that apply to everyone, right? And so that's the Article 1, Section 8 part of the Constitution that says what the federal government can do, or from the state level if the state is exercising their police powers, right? And then once those laws are made and are generally applicable, the legislative branch can delegate some of its power to the executive branch, which is where administrative agencies live, right? And so the administrative agencies then are given direction to create more specific rules and regulations in order to implement those generally applicable statutes. So like the Clean Air Act is super vague. It says something, oh man, I know the exact words because I've said them so many times. Pollutants which endanger the public health. EPA has the authority to regulate pollutants which endanger the public health. What the hell does that mean? Well, Congress doesn't know, right? The people who passed those laws, they didn't endanger public health, right? So they give the job to the EPA. And the EPA has scientists, and scientists figure out what pollutants endanger public health and how, right? So that's the job of these administrative law, the administrative agencies, to create both lists of those pollutants that endanger public health and then put limits on how much can be emitted from various sources. So the federal law gives some general guidelines to the agencies about what type of information they're looking for and how they go about their job, but it's then up to the agencies to apply that. So I think we're going to see this a little bit, more when we get deeper into utility regulation, but the state legislature in Oregon has passed a lot of laws that say, Public Utility Commission, you're an agency, you have the authority to do this and that. And then the Public Utility Agency Commission kind of says, oh, we don't really know how to do that. And then they don't really do anything. And then later the state legislature comes back and says, no, do it and do it this way, right? So that is the level of authority between those two, the legislature and then the administrative agencies. And the agencies can't do anything that goes outside of what the law has enabled them to do. So if you have had any interest in environmental law in the last 4 years, this might sound familiar. This is really what most of the arguments are about. Okay. All right. Any questions before I go any further? This is the fun stuff to talk about in my class. Students love it. All right. All right, so let's get to the next section. How can Oregon utility regulation decarbonize via natural gas reductions? So first we'll talk about which utilities are regulated and why, who participates and how. We'll talk about what kind of regulation, such as the laws that are in place now and the executive branch, right? The executive order from Governor Brown, and how the Public Utility Commission as an administrative agency implements those laws. So that is the order of operation that we will go through. So first, which utilities and why? So why? States regulate to provide safe, reliable, affordable energy to the public. So an old Supreme Court case in 1876 said that state regulation is allowed to ensure essential services, in our case, energy, that are, quote, affected with the public interest. Energy is so important to our lives, even back in 1876, that the state could regulate it to make sure that, you know, the public was served by that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that utilities are a natural monopoly. So it wouldn't make sense to have, you know, multiple companies with their own electric poles and lines, right, running down every single street. That wouldn't make any sense. It would also not make any sense to have a bunch of separate natural gas distribution, you know, pipes under the ground, right? And then you decide which company you're going to buy from. So the state divides up its areas and provides every utility with its service area that other utilities aren't allowed to be in. So they are a natural monopoly. They don't have any price or quality competition, which is what economics would tell us would keep prices low, right, and quality high. That's not there. So they can basically do whatever they want with us, except that the states regulate them, right? And the other characteristic of regulated utilities is that we regulate investor-owned utilities. So investor-owned utilities are where shareholders own the utility. It's a private company. It's a corporate structure, right? People who don't live here are the ones, and people who aren't customers of the utility, frankly, in most cases probably, are not the people who are making decisions or who are profiting from what's happening, right? So in Oregon, we have the electric utilities. Pacific Power serves us, except for a little part of Corvallis. That's Consumers Power, which is a cooperative, so it's not regulated in the same way. We also have Portland General Electric, and Idaho Power has some service territory in Eastern Oregon. And then we also have our natural gas utilities, and that's the service area that you see on the map in the light blue. So Northwest Natural serves this area, okay, including us. And these are for-profit corporations, and so that's why the Public Utility Commission gets to have a say over what they charge us, right, for purchasing their services. So that's why states get to regulate from the very general perspective of law and economics. So what do natural gas utilities do? Okay, so they buy gas from suppliers. So the, you know, on the left half of the screen, all this stuff, these, you know, the natural gas wells, and then the refining and the storage and all that stuff, that all happens outside of Northwest Natural. They buy the fuel, and then they own and operate all of the stuff on the right side, right? So they own the lines, they own gas storage facilities as well, and they serve industrial and commercial and residential customers. Okay, so that's their business model. The city gate here is also important because there is the ability to, you know, the city has a franchise agreement with that utility. So kind of the rules of how they operate within the city, that can be part of that agreement. So there is a little bit of leverage there with the city. Question, does state or local have authority to assign utility vendors? In Oregon, it's the state, and I haven't investigated this question super directly, but I would be shocked if I found out that that we could choose a different company, because the state has granted Northwest Natural its service territory. So I think that preempts, right, precedes the choices that we get to make in relation to them. So that's my probably 99% sure answer that I don't think we can change. Okay, So this is what their business model looks like. And as I was making this presentation today, it kind of hit me, oh, so this is the supply side on the left, right? Supplying natural gas. And what the utilities do, this is really the demand side, right? This is all of us and our use of that natural gas. So when we think about decreasing or changing the amount of some fuel we use, we can affect supply or demand because they have to be equal, right? So if you bring down demand, there's not as much need for supply. If you bring down supply, you're actually going to increase prices if demand stays the same, right? So that's going to hurt people. It also will incentivize anyone who still is able to provide supply because they can get a higher price, right? So when you think about, an industry like this, economics can help inform thinking about, what's the way to approach this. And of course, decreasing both at the same time is fabulous if we can do it, but we've divided it up into different areas of authority. So it's not always that easy. Okay. All right, any questions about that stuff before I move on? Good. Okay. The next thing we will do is who participates and how to participate. So when we make state level utility decisions, right, the state legislature and the Public Utility Commission are in the center, they make the decisions. Of course, utilities want to have a say. They lobby just like anybody else. They can't charge us consumers though when they lobby, which is a good thing in Oregon, not true in all of their states. Industry, of course, wants to lobby because it's about their fuel cost, and that has an impact on their business. So industry is always showing up also and making their interests heard. Environmental and public interest groups, more and more involved in a lot of these decisions, as they should be, right? And then ratepayers and citizens, we have, independent voice at the legislature and the PUC if we want to. But we also have the Citizens Utility Board. And this is a really unique organization. There's only a couple of independent organizations like this in the country. Wisconsin was the first. California had an independent nonprofit who did similar things, but not organized exactly the same way as ours. And so other states don't have this, and you see that results in a lot of their utility decisions, unfortunately for them. There are times I've listened to podcasts about utility issues in other states, and I'm shouting back at my podcast, that would never happen in Oregon. So this is pretty cool. So CUB was created through a ballot initiative in 1984. So that also was unique in that way. The citizens of the state voted for this, right? And so, but it's an independent nonprofit that is required by law to exist. And its job is to be the voice for residential utility customers and counter utility and industry power. Because if you think about how technical a lot of these decisions are, as you will see, all of us ratepayers and citizens have a hard time with this kind of very technical Public Utility Commission type of making decisions. I have a hard time with it, and I'm trained kind of in these areas, but this is such a niche thing. I'm not a utility economist or an energy economist, right? So we have an organization who has this expertise, and CUB advocates for utility policy that reflects our values and our needs. And so the things that we really think about, is it affordable? Is it accessible? Is it reliable and resilient? And is it clean? Because when you do the analysis, what you find is that clean energy is more affordable, accessible, reliable, and resilient when the system is constructed correctly, right? So CUB has been supporting clean energy for a very long time because this was clearly coming on the horizon for a very long time, as a lot of you know. So going back to, CUB speaks the language of economics and law. They have a lawyer on staff. They have a couple of economists on staff. They're a small but mighty organization that really, I think, punches above their weight, we like to say, at the legislature and at the PUC, because, they take few resources and they're able to do this analysis that really makes a difference, engage with members, advocacy, through lobbying and PUC work, so that Oregonians have a voice in the room, because otherwise it's pretty much just industry and utility that have the money for that kind of advocacy, right? So CUB is there doing that work. So I am the president of the CUB board now. I didn't know about CUB until I got an email asking me to join the board a couple of years ago. And I was like, but I don't even know this organization. But learning about it, talking to other board members, I decided to become a member and then become a member of the board and then now become the president. And I'm just super impressed by this small but mighty organization over and over again. So you can join CUB, check them out online, become a member, do action alerts. They do a lot of good work. That's where you can find the website and all the social media. All right, any questions about CUB before I go on? Because I know I'm a big CUB cheerleader. Okay, you must all be members. I just got my newsletter today, so you can read about what CUB's been doing this summer. All right, so now we're going to get into what kind of regulation. This is the wonky stuff, so I hope you are feeling alert and ready. Otherwise, this will totally wake you up, right? So let's go back to our lines of authority here. The Oregon Public Utility Commission, right? So we have state statutes that control, all of the laws that have been passed by the legislature are in these statutes that that give the PUC their job. And then the PUC is the executive branch agency that regulates the investor-owned utilities in Oregon. Okay, electricity, natural gas, there's a little bit of water sewer stuff like in the Portland area, I think, telecom, a little bit more so in the past than now, since everybody has cell phones and this has become a federal matter. So, so this is the authority that we're talking about here. Oh, Mike and Margie asked, how is CUB funded? So CUB is funded by members for one thing, but CUB is also funded through what we call intervener funding. So when CUB works, when CUB does their work at the Public Utility Commission, there is a state law that allows CUB and or other interested groups to apply for what's called intervener funding. So if there's a decision to be made by the PUC that affects utilities, CUB gets to intervene in that, right? And put time and effort into advocating for the customers. And then the utilities actually have to pay the intervener funding for CUB to do its work. So that is a big part of the CUB budget. And it's part of the state law that allows CUB to do its work. When CUB does want to intervene in proceeding at the Public Utility Commission, they have to file something that requests intervener funding in this situation, and then can get it. And so that's where a lot of it comes from. So it's directly the work at the PUC, but they do lots of other stuff. They get grants, they get membership funding and other stuff too. So all of those ways CUB is funded. Okay, so back to utilities. All right, so the federal government is also obviously involved, and I just wanted to point that out. So, and this is again, kind of going back to the slide before that showed the structure of the natural gas system, that the federal side has the Natural Gas Act for construction and operation of interstate pipelines. administered by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is the executive branch agency. But also, fracking on public lands would be controlled by the federal government. Methane release is regulated by the EPA through the Clean Air Act. And so there's various federal laws, again, that apply. So also, as I was going through this and making this today, I also realized, oh, look, this is kind of the supply and the demand bit, right? So the federal government has a lot of power over supply of natural gas. How much it costs would be a big part of it, right? If you increase the costs by having more and more regulations, that means it has to be safer or control leaks and so forth, that would have an impact on this equation. And from the state side, now Oregon's just one state, but if all states were using their authority, then we could have a really big impact on the demand side as well. Okay, so again, intertwining law and economics. And I'm seeing these parallels all of a sudden to, where the regulation happens. All right, here comes, it's just gonna get wonkier, get ready. So from those state laws, there is let me look at your question first. Regarding regulations, safe, reliable, and affordable. It seems that the PUC made decisions consistent, lowest cost rather than affordable to whom, right? So I think I'm going to answer your question next. But now that the price of wind and solar has come down so much, yes, not so much the case anymore. So there's an assumption embedded in the question, right? A reluctance to raise rates to support long-term environmentally sound infrastructure. So I think what we have found over time is that, yes, as the price of wind and solar has come down, it becomes the least cost resource, right? And therefore, like it was some years ago, man, like 4, 5, 6, I've lost track of kind of my sense of time sometimes after the pandemic. It seems like longer, but Texas at some point, like in the last 10 years, their equivalent of the Public Utility Commission said, we're only going to be installing wind and solar in Texas from here on out because it's the least cost. Like, isn't that wild? So in a state that you would think their values didn't align, their decisions had to be made based on a least cost model. And so wind and solar had been the least cost in Texas. Texas, I think, is #1 in the country for wind installation, isn't it? Or #2, I think it might be #1 now. So, the analysis that CUB has done, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I'm just thinking, generally about what we've talked about in board meetings and what I've seen the evidence for. And it's that as we have made our electricity cleaner, rates have stayed the same or come down. And so that's why, when I talked about the clean part of CUB's mission, supporting affordable, accessible, reliable, resilient, right? All of these things need to happen at the same time. Does that help or make sense? And that's also my, one of the sources of my Venn diagram comment. These things are overlapping more and more. Good. All right, but this actually is a good question leading to talking about integrated resource plans. So integrated resource plans are, generally in the law and more specifically addressed in public utility orders and decisions about how exactly they happen, okay? But the general deal is that utilities, including natural gas utilities, create these 20-year integrated resource plans, and they do it every 2 years. So it's constantly being updated, right? So you do it this year, you do it in 2020 for 2040, and then you do it in 2022 for 2042. So you're constantly updating your plans, okay? And truly constantly. And by the time one is done, the next one needs to start. So Yes, to meet the 20 years of energy needs as projected within the legal requirements, because there's all these layers of other legal requirements. And the PUC says this has to be the least cost, least risk combination of supply and demand management. So in this PUC order from 2007, they were recognizing that high risk decisions, which at the time could have been sort of installing new fossil fuel infrastructure, carried with it some risk, right? Risk that you're going to be regulated, that it's going to therefore be more expensive. You might have to do pollution control equipment. Maybe we get a price on carbon, maybe someday, right? But there's risks with that. And so recognizing that there's risk that comes with every decision you make and that interacts with cost was a very forward-looking thing for Oregon to do. And this is an important thing to realize. And the utilities didn't like it. And it's really interesting to read the order and read their objections to it, right? But this is what the PUC now requires. This is a stakeholder-driven process. Environmental groups show up, CUB obviously shows up, anybody can show up. And the utilities have workshops and they put out what they think their plans are, and people object and say, well, we think there's a lot of risk here. We think that could be very expensive in the long run, so on and so forth, right? So this is a way in to the utility process. Once it's done, then the PUC acknowledges that plan, which shows that they've been prudent about thinking about their options, and they will be legally compliant with whatever requirements that they have. Okay. And then any prudent investments that are made, and that's an important word, can be recovered in the rates that consumers pay us, right? Now, just because, I would back up if I could. Just because something is in an integrated resource plan doesn't mean it necessarily would be prudent later when the investment is actually made. The PUC still has to think about whether particular investments at the time they are made are prudent or not, okay? And if they're not prudent, then we don't have to pay for them. So in rate making, then PUC looks at all of the investments that the utility wants to recover, and the utility asks to charge each class of customers, residential, commercial, and industrial, a certain rate based on what these investments are doing to serve that class of customers. There is no guarantee of their authorized rate of return. So they do get a rate of return that is authorized on whatever that investment base is, but there's no guarantee that they're going to make that, okay? They also have to meet their sales goals and manage costs. So they could make more, they could make less than what they were anticipating, depending on how they manage the rest of their business. And the PUC has the final say on rates, including the cost of stranded assets, okay? So if this happened, this is one of the great CUB wins. The Pacific Power made some investments in a coal plant in Wyoming to update the pollution control system, which seems really nice and prudent, right? But CUB was able to show that it would actually have been more cost effective to shut that thing down and get supply from somewhere else, rather than investing in more equipment that then was going to make it increase the useful life of this coal plant, right? And the PUC said, no, Pacific Core, you cannot charge that investment in that coal plant to consumers in Oregon. So that's where you can really, make some differences too. So that would be stranded assets, an investment they made that they don't get to recover. And so that has to come out of their profits. They have to eat that. When we're talking about natural gas utilities, right, they're going to have a hard time decarbonizing, as we see. And if the law allows them to buy carbon offsets instead to meet their targets, then they could probably charge that to consumers. So the PUC has to determine, like, was it more prudent to buy carbon offsets, or was it more prudent to take these other steps that would have met your goal, right? Your greenhouse gas targets instead. So the utilities, like, they're not guaranteed anything. So Larry, yes, they do make money by building capacity, but things like energy efficiency is also an investment, right? So utilities are required, the least cost, least risk choice of supply and demand management, right? So if the utility can make efficiency upgrades, which might include subsidizing all of us households to do weatherization, right? That would be an investment that they make. And actually there is some kind of base level that they always have to put in integrated resource planning that is about energy efficiency. It is truly the least cost, least risk thing they can do. So yes, they do make money on their investments, but those investments, you can think of that as a very broad category, and they can be really beneficial to decarbonization too. Or like transmission capacity would be great from some areas that have great wind resources, for example. So what investments is more important? And they don't, here's the corollary to what you were, to also the comment about investments, they don't make money just by selling more. And that's really important here too. If they were incentivized to just sell more and more electricity, then we wouldn't get any energy efficiency. So the system makes some good sense in some ways. Okay, who serves on the PUC? It is an administrative body. It is, gosh, I'm blanking on how many commissioners there are. Megan Decker is the current chair. I'm thinking there's 3, but that seems too small. They are appointed by the governor. So they better be employees of the state because they have a lot of work to do. And they do have a staff. So if you look at any of the PUC dockets, you will see a lot of staff work. The PUC staff does a tremendous amount of research and, puts a lot of effort into these decisions themselves, and also takes testimony from utilities, takes testimony from CUB, takes testimony from industry. Individuals, you can comment on what happens at the PUC if you want to too. So it's open for public comment. Northwest Natural had an insert. They were applying for an 11% increase. I'm sorry, Nancy, I do not know. I do not remember what happened with the Northwest Natural rate increase, or.
Okay,
Sorry, I can look it up, but I don't know off the top of my head. So.
Thank
you. I do know that Pacific Power asked for a huge rate increase and actually got a small rate decrease out of the PUC after some CUB and other testimony in part.
Right, for the PUC.
Yes, I know. So this all matters, makes a difference. Okay. All right. That's integrated resource planning, and it's super interesting. It's kind of fun to look at the plans too, but it's hard to keep up, honestly. All right, so we also know that Governor Brown issued this Executive Order 2004, directing state agencies to take action to reduce and regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And Section 5 is all about the Public Utility Commission. So there's a lot of things in Section 5, but the ones that I pulled out for our purposes in natural gas are that utility portfolios and consumer programs have to reduce risks and costs to consumers by making a rapid reduction of greenhouse gases. So that is, those two things have to happen together, right? We also want to prioritize activities to advance decarbonization and to work on differential energy burdens and other inequities, including rate design. So that's going to come up again in a minute as well. So the PUC is working under this executive order to do a lot of what I'm going to talk about next. All right, so they're in the middle of this fact finding. So it is a PUC docket. Anything the PUC does, they put it on their docket. It's something they will do. This at this point is a fact finding, and there's 2 phases in this one, but then there's going to be another component of it that comes after this phase 1 and phase 2 of this docket is done. I don't know the timeline for that at this point. So right now where we're at here is this part in phase 2, we are in here now. So they've done some research. The utilities have said, here's how we plan to reduce our greenhouse gases, right? Now they're supposed to come back with some revised models. And this is where we are now. I think yesterday or the day before there was a workshop. And I don't think the slides and stuff were up for it yet when I was making this presentation. So the staff are thinking about what are the regulatory tools we can use to apply to utilities, and then they will do this final report, and then rulemaking would come later. So this is where we are in the process right now. In the, I believe, first workshop, reported back in the second workshop, they stated that these are the aligned goals of all of the parties, including the utilities. So everyone wants to achieve the 2035 greenhouse gas reductions in Executive Order 2004. So that's 45% below 1990 levels by 2035. So right now they're just planning to get to that 2035 point, and then they will plan for the 2050 point. But if we don't hit 2035, right, it's going to be that much harder to get to the 80% or more reduction by 2050. So that's, they're looking ahead to 35 at this point. They also need to understand the cost to impacted communities, including low-income and environmental justice communities. And what are the long-term planning and improvements that have to be made? Both, I think, in the utility regulatory process, like how do we think about cost, risks, and benefits, given that we want to constrain emissions, and what do those utilities look like in the future? And they specifically called out renewable natural gas and hydrogen as something that they wanted to learn more about in this process. So we'll talk about each of these. And I don't want to lose sight of the fact, and I've organized the rest of it according to these 3+1 pillars of deep decarbonization. So that's my organizational method for thinking about some of these questions and how they're dealing with them. Do you have any questions? My cheeks are warm. This room gets warm, I think, when I'm standing in here talking. All right, well, pillar 1, energy efficiency. So just looking at this little graph, demand 2018 to 2050 generally increases, right? Because we have more people and we therefore have more energy use and more demand in our system. But our energy intensity is decreasing. That means we use less energy per thing that we want to do. That's the same thing as saying energy efficiency. So even though we have more people, we've been using less electricity and other energy, which is awesome. Energy efficiency in Oregon is dealt with very much with our public purpose charge on our bills. So if you're a customer of Pacific Power, as most of us in Corvallis are, you pay this charge on your bill every month. And then those funds are collected and they go into energy efficiency programs through the Energy Trust of Oregon, and they get distributed to some other state programs as well. Natural gas does have a public purpose charge, not through the same law, but through some settlements with the Public Utility Commission. And energy efficiency has system-wide benefits. So Energy Trust estimates that for every $1 that Energy Trust spends on efficiency, it saves $3 for our whole system by reducing the need to build more generation of electricity or supplying more natural gas. So that is awesome. That's why it's least cost, least risk, right? There's no risk in energy efficiency. You just use less. It's awesome. And it's least cost. It's like the cheapest thing you can possibly do to support the whole system. So I think this is important though for our purposes. So the Energy Trust, when it designs its programs, it uses the same PUC cost effectiveness tests and utility cost effectiveness tests. They don't compare across technologies that use different fuels. And Energy Trust may not and does not advocate for fuel switching. They can provide fuel neutral technical information to the public. Now, that decision came out of the PUC. It's not in state law that the Energy Trust has to be, quote, fuel neutral. The PUC has the authority to change that rule to incentivize fuel switching. So if you have wondered, if you have a natural gas furnace and wondered why you don't get some extra special, help in switching to a high efficiency electric heat pump, this is why. Because the Energy Trust cannot incentivize you to do so. So this would be one thing that could be changed. Let's talk to the PUC about this. It is not explicitly on the agenda of this current fact finding or investigation, but this could be a future thing that they deal with. CUB has long been, let's say, unhappy about this decision. So that would be something that CUB also would be happy to advocate for and has advocated for changing that. Oh, got to remember my stars. That's important. All right, the 2021 session had some good energy efficiency bills. I just wanted to show you briefly. We have new state energy efficiency appliance standards, what can be sold in state and how efficient they are. And the important thing too about this, the wonky thing, is that this used to be a hard process, but the law changed it so that the Oregon Department of Energy, the Oregon Department of Energy can update efficiency standards now through rulemaking, and it's way easier than it was in the past. The state also updated the state building codes so that they call them the REACH standards. So they look at what is coming in the future. And so new buildings can reach for what is going to be the best soon. And local communities can adopt those standards as well. So that would be something that could happen at the local level, in addition to the state level. And the Healthy Homes Bill is important because the Oregon Health Authority gets some money to provide grants to like neighborhood or other weatherization entities that help low-income households and landlords do weatherization. So those are all good energy efficiency bills and money that got passed last session. All right, questions about efficiency first? Whoops, let's go back. Good with efficiency? We love efficiency. Whoops, went too far. Okay. Pillar 2 is decarbonization, right? So Oregon had a renewable portfolio standard in 2007, kept getting updated. You know, that just means that the investor-owned electric utilities have to get a certain percent clean energy in their portfolio. And then the Oregon Coal to Clean bill said we were going to totally phase out coal by 2030, close the Boardman plant in 2020. That was a really cool, I mean, when I learned about like what CUB had, CUB like set up that whole negotiation, and that was so cool because they took some, they leveraged some federal pollution control laws, and similar to the story I told before, negotiated to close the Boardman plant early rather than put in that pollution control equipment and keep it running for another 20 plus years, right? So closing the Boardman coal plant in 2020 was a really big win. So we have those laws in effect. And then in 2021, we got the 100% clean energy for all. So investor-owned electric utilities that serve 74% of Oregonians have to have 100% clean energy by 2040. This is the most ambitious renewable energy or clean energy goal in the country now. And it will also apply to some electric service suppliers that serve large customers. So that is cool. So we're doing the decarbonizing electricity bit. The thing to remember though about this is that as we expand electrification, right, and shift away from natural gas, the electric system is going to have more and more load, right, more demand. So these things are happening simultaneously, and we want that demand to be met with carbon-free supply of electricity, and not only want to, has to be. So we have to be managing affordability, safety, reliability, resilience, all at the same time as that supply and demand of electricity is changing. So it's awesome to decarbonize electricity, but it's happening in the context of more changes in this system. And then the PUC and other agencies have to understand that the energy systems act as a whole. So there are opportunities for complementary services between them. There may be conflicts. So if you just look at electricity by itself and just look at natural gas by itself, you're missing the picture. So the decarbonization pathway modeling has to happen across those fuel types to understand how those shifts will be important. So that's something the PUC needs to be able to do, you know, in its toolkit. So yeah, the gas plant. Well, my understanding too, though, is that they also negotiated to get more hydro. So I'm going to have to look that up again. You haven't heard, okay, the capacity of transmission lines. Rob, the transmission line issue is not in my brain right now. I can't really answer that question. If we have time at the end though, I have an electrical engineer who works on this stuff, who lives here in my house. I'm married to him. He's my go-to on these kinds of transmission issues. So if we have time afterwards, we can ask him that question. I'll grab him. Okay. All right. Okay. So here we are at pillar 3, switching direct use of fuels like natural gas to electric sources. Okay. So I pulled this in part directly or paraphrased from Northwest Natural's investor relations presentation from this month. Okay, so they say to their investors, we have a favorable customer mix. Okay, this is where they get their profits. 64% from residential customers, right? So their business depends on residential heating services. And we have to remember when we think about the equity and affordability issues that many Oregonians rely on natural gas now for heating as well. So that's why it's so important to keep the affordability in our minds, because there's a lot of households that could be hurt with much higher natural gas prices unless we can help them switch away, right? So they are really a big part of our whole energy system. They deliver more energy, just, you know, pure BTUs than any other utility. They heat 74% of our residential square footage in the service areas. And when it gets really cold, 90% of our energy needs are coming from natural gas. So this isn't a small part of the system, which what makes it hard. So we should acknowledge that it's hard, right? So keeping this in mind, right, this is a problem. It's a problem because Northwest Natural is going to fight for its profit margin base, but it's also a problem for Oregonians, and we need to plan it well, okay? Actually, my neighbor, Loretta, who's here, gave me the mailer that Northwest Natural sent out recently. Maybe a lot of you got it, which was pretty much just like, help us say that we're going to be a great low carbon pathway, but we're not really sure that that's true, right? So, and to make you feel better, I don't think they can put this into our bills when they send us this stuff either. So we should keep that in mind. All right. So yeah, Pam, so we're going to talk more about that shortly, about financial impact converting. So stay tuned. All right. So talking about costs, what we know is that electrification reaches our greenhouse gas goals with overall cost savings over time. So to help you read this graph first, this came out of Evolved Energy Research. This is Oregon specific from last June. Okay, so this line that I just put in, above the line will be higher costs over time, and above the line will be below the line will be savings over time. So you can see where the lines go. So I'm going to show you what 3 of their pathways are showing. So this is the low transformation. So this is 100% reductions by 2050, but it's the low transformation model, meaning that we do not transform energy systems. So, and as you can see, look at where the arrow goes. By 2050, this is by far the high cost pathway because we are not electrifying end uses, right? So we're not electrifying our homes and so forth. It spikes a little bit here in 2025. It's a little bit lower in 2030, but overall, not electrifying is a high cost route. The 80% by 2050 electrifying, so putting emphasis on electrification, the black line, this one decarbonizes faster and it's among the lowest costs. So it's, it's higher cost here in 2030, but then it drops and it stays low. So that is awesome. Okay. And then if you look at the 100% by 2050 scenarios, they stay pretty cost competitive here, the blue and the gray with the others up until, 2035 or so. But getting that last 20% of emissions out of the system requires more investment and is a little more expensive. Still savings, but a little more expensive. Now, I would just say the caveat to this kind of modeling is that when we're looking out into the future, we know that technology improves and costs fall over time. So just like an integrated resource plan, this would be updated, updated, updated. Maybe it'll be easier to get that last 20% by that time. Not really sure. So, all right. I'm just going to look at the chat here. Yes. Okay. All right. So what's up with renewable natural gas? The first CUB policy conference I went to, I think there was a panel on renewable natural gas and my eyes almost rolled out of my head. They rolled so hard when I heard that term, renewable natural gas. Greenwashing anyone? So it's a thing. Our goal set out in state law is to get 30% renewable natural gas by 2050. And the PUC creates these programs in order to let utilities, and they are, utilities are experimenting with some of it right now. Obviously, it would be more expensive, and which is why the PUC wouldn't normally allow it, right? So what is it? They capture and refine methane from natural processes like wastewater treatment, such as sewers, landfills, or dairy manure. A lot could also be generated from biomass, or other processes, but those are all higher costs. Analysis shows that renewable natural gas does have 40 to 50% lower emissions than fossil gas, frack gas, because that methane would have come out of the sewer or the landfill anyway, right? So you're capturing it. Now it's not being released. And we know that it has a greater warming potential. So immediately you capture it and then you burn it and it converts to CO2. So it's still a greenhouse gas, but it's a lower potency, but lasts a longer time. So economists do really cool things with like the trade-offs between methane versus CO2. But the analysis is that it does have lower emissions, and it avoids some of the demand for fossil gas. So, okay, that's what it is. But it's not going to be something that just replaces, fossil gas in our system. So right now, the best analysis shows that we can only replace, here's our technical potential for renewable natural gas in Oregon compared to our total gas usage is only 19%. And 80% of that is from thermal gasification, which is not the sewers, landfills, or manure. So that's real tough. Its costs are higher compared to frack gas, and it's more expensive than electrification. So if you look at these graphs, so these are estimated costs in 2040. If we shift this direction, fossil gas is very cheap, which is why we started using it so much. And renewable natural gas is estimated to be, much, much more expensive than that. So I think the takeaway is that RNG is useful, right? For a few hard to decarbonize users, like industrial or commercial settings. There are places where it's going to be really hard to get out of natural gas. So, if you can cut those emissions by 50%, great, but it's not going to replace everything that's on, all of the residential and commercial buildings, right? That is much better done with electrification. So this is a takeaway from people who are doing this analysis. And so I think that's a good takeaway, that I would rather, see RNG than fossil gas, but let's use it where it's worth using, right? I don't know that satisfies Northwest Natural. I don't think it does, because look back at where their profits came from, right? They're going to fight to keep the residential and commercial buildings on their system. Yeah, Karen, I'm down with better than nothing at all points. So that's cool. Yes. So this is a problem for the utilities. And they want to tell us that it's like the best thing ever. But, the science says that it's just not going to do what they say it's going to do. All right. And then my should be pillar 4, equity for underadvantaged communities and environmental justice. So here's a problem that CUB foresees, and it's talked about a lot. So electrification starts with households that can afford to do it, like my household. Okay. We got off natural gas. I didn't get the flyer. I'm not a customer. We had our meter removed. We're great, right? But that leaves all the other households on the system, those that cannot afford to electrify, or, like all the constraints that households face, right? They will bear the cost of the remaining system. So this is just a little graph of what goes into your bill when you're a California natural gas consumer. I couldn't quite find an Oregon one right away, But most of that is the distribution system, right? Keeping all of the pipes and everything in the ground and maintaining them. So when you take a lot of people, right, and you have a big charge, a big dollar amount, and you divide it up among smaller and smaller numbers of people, that means everybody left pays more. And it's going to be the people who can't afford it that end up paying more if we don't plan. Okay, so Oregon does have some nice environmental justice laws on the books that came recently. So the PUC has been working on getting equity into all their decisions and now has a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion. CUB had long advocated for authorizing the PUC to set different rates for low-income households. So getting that into state law, because the PUC wouldn't do it on their own, was a big win. And we've updated the public purpose charge, which reduces it now, but has other mechanisms for shifting more money into energy efficiency from the utilities. So all good. So how do we electrify while advancing environmental justice? Okay. Use energy efficiency funding for low income fuel switching. So I talked about that earlier. Energy Trust should be doing that, right? Stop expanding the gas system because it's being expanded based on the current cheap fracked gas. So putting a moratorium on natural gas hookups would be cool. That would have to happen state level, or local level, but local's not everybody, right? And that would minimize the utility's stranded assets when electrification increases. So you don't want them investing in a bunch of stuff now that's not going to be used later. We talked about that a little bit in rates. We could ban the sale of new gas fueled appliances, which phases in electric. I think Nancy made that point in the chat earlier, right? And branch pruning. So these are all proposals out of California right now. We saw a webinar with a study on this, and this was an interesting idea. So you strategically retire geographic areas in your distribution infrastructure. So you electrify everyone on one branch, right? So then you can cut out a whole block of houses at once, rather than, having to keep that infrastructure in place and being used for just a few houses, right? So that could be a very planned way to do it. And that both had high decarbonization and lowish costs, right? There's like trade-offs among all of these different things. So that showed that, all of these are policies that could be pursued that had a nice mix of decarbonization at lower costs. All right, so here's the 4 recommendations that came out of all of that. Why? Stick to the 3 pillars, incorporate electrification into low-income weatherization and energy efficiency, shrink the gas system in a proactive, planned way for certainty and efficiency, and RNG and/or hydrogen is useful for those hard to switch uses, right? So yes, Keith, all of this would be a huge fight. That is the caveat for all of it. But again, this is the legally possible, economically feasible, technically feasible things. We have to, right, assert our values and why it's a good path. So yep, that is the rub though, right? Just wanted to mention local governments. Of course, local governments have power too, and cities can control a lot of things that emit greenhouse gases. So residential and commercial building energy use could have some big reductions in emissions. We also have waste management here that we could look at from a local level. Maybe the question Margie or Mike asked a while ago about how can we switch providers? Well, maybe we can be a branch that is pruned, right? What if local governments could volunteer to be the branch that is pruned off the natural gas system? And what would the local government have to do to electrify everyone within that jurisdiction, right? Now, that's a hard question, but that might be a route. So, all right. Oh, that's what I just said. Electrification and branch pruning, possibly, maybe. All right, so we only have 5 minutes left. I just want to leave you with the fact that this is a solvable problem. Scientists, or we used to be talking about 5 degrees of warming as, you know, the no policy business as usual. That is now considered highly unlikely. We are now, the latest reports I saw are 2.7 degrees of warming, which is still bad, but look at all that we've done, right? So we're not up here in this world anymore. We've made changes, we're moving, we can still move down. There's still hope. There's the Cub info again. We will leave you with the PUC information, and that can send it to you. Unless you want to jot stuff down right now, but you will have access to this. So 4 minutes left. Any other questions? I'll go through the chat real quick. Yes, it is a big political problem. I agree with Keith. Sometimes it's easier for things to happen at the state level through a wonky administrative agency too, though. Anything else? 3 minutes. Don't see any hands.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions or comments, Christy, we just want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. I agree. Larry just said fantastic presentation, and we have been recording this, so we'll probably be able to get it up on our website by later next week. And Christy was kind enough to share her slides from the presentation that she did last week on transportation electrification. And hopefully you'll share these slides as well. Is that right?
Yep.
So we will be sending those out and making people aware through our Google groups that those are available. And I just wanted to thank everybody who stayed on here tonight to hear Christy's presentation. And we really want to encourage you, everybody who was here, to take what you've learned tonight and turn it into action, because our voices really do matter. And each of us can add to the chorus that's urging our government agencies and elected officials to take bold action to address climate change as quickly as possible. We know that there's no time left to take a business as usual approach to our climate emergency. Each one of us can make a difference, not only by influencing public policy, but also by serving as models through our daily lifestyle choices, how we power our homes, what we eat, how we transport ourselves, and the countless other choices that we make every day. So thank you all for attending tonight's program. Again, thank you, Christy. And, you know, just appreciate that everybody's part of this journey that we're taking together. So hope you all have a great evening, and see you soon.
Thanks, Annette.
Sure.
Mike, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, I was just curious about how you would go about this branch pruning on a smaller scale. I think as a joke, I said, well, how about we prune OSU first?
Yeah, I saw that. I agree.
At least that's a, you know, that's a single entity with,
Mhm.
you know, the single feed of, you know, a single line of gas coming in. But I was saying about the, you know, could you imagine the possibility of taking a neighborhood or a block in the city and people who voluntarily, you know, want to get off of natural gas and have them all electrify and then shut down, you know, that small branch. But I wonder if there's any way really to organize something like that or to bring it about. I could.
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, doing it neighborhood by neighborhood is one thing, but the utility still is maintaining the bigger system around it. When they talk about branch pruning, I don't know how big a branch they're talking about, right? But yeah, it does have to start, little by little. But
Or,
the idea
Anyway,
I think is you do it through a regulatory way so that the PUC says to Northwest Natural, what are your branches where you're serving very few customers?
Mm.
Those people have to be moved off and you have to pay for it, right? And then you shut down those lines, and so I think you have to look at their system and make them look at their system, right? And find where those natural boundaries are.
yeah, and lines that were serving very few customers are also probably high cost to maintain because they don't have the basis to support it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, start by not allowing new lines because there you're creating branches, right? First off, stop creating branches. And then you find those places. And so it would be really, wouldn't it be cool? Wouldn't it be revolutionary if the PUC told them, make a process for identifying your branches and we will approve them little by little?
Yeah.
Or you have to remove 10% of the branches every year or something. I don't know how they do it, but it's a fascinating and I think really smart way to approach the problem.
Well, for some reason, Marge is right here, but she's typing in a question rather than.
Okay. All
Well,
right.
and in the meantime, Keith has his hand up.
Yep.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So would you like to tell us a little bit what happened in Eugene? Didn't they kind of put the pressure on Northwest Natural and made it harder for them to expand, or what happened there?
Yeah, I don't know honestly where they ended up. They were in negotiations for changing their utility franchise agreement. And the last I heard was about the negotiations going back and forth. So it was something like, we're going to charge you more for this franchise agreement and we're going to take the money and use it for, electrification and weatherization and stuff. And I don't know if they're done. Does anyone know if they're done? It's definitely a great revolutionary also way to think about it, but I don't know where it ended. I'm sorry. Anybody know? Or if it's ended? Last I heard, I think negotiations broke down. So I'm sorry, I can't tell you more. Impasse, yeah. And, oh, right, and then if they come to an impasse, Northwest Natural is kind of technically then operating without a contract, and maybe that imposes some fines on them. Yeah, there was something, yeah. Sorry, I don't know the fine details, but the fact that they came to an impasse, I think, is not a good sign. And that Northwest Natural has a lot of power still. Anybody else?
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, then I think we'll call it an evening. And again, thanks to Christy and thanks to everybody for attending tonight.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. You also give me hope. I tell my students they give me hope. You also give me hope. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Take care.